see I've just started recording. A couple other notes. All of our questions during this webinar will be through the text chat box. So if you do have a question, please type it into that chat box, just like any instant messenger. You can see you can choose who sees that message. Feel free to send those questions to everyone. If you have a technical problem, it's probably best to send that just to the presenters. And if you click on that drop-down box, you'll see presenters as the second option. You do have some other controls at the bottom left. Raise hand, agree, disagree, step away, speak louder, softer, etc. Feel free to use those. Those will be little notifications that come up on our screen. The questions, Bob may answer those as he's going through his presentation, or he may choose to wait till the end. So just be patient if he doesn't get to it until after his presentation. If we don't have a chance to get to your question, we will try to email you later, but that's probably not going to be too much of an issue today. If you do have additional questions, you can email them to Andrew Kling at that address there. Okay. We do have a couple polls we're going to ask you to fill out. We'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to show you our website. And this is the main homepage of the webinar recording website that I brought up for you. It's chock full of great information, including our newsletters and a whole lot of publications and different resources and publications. Our website and the address are going to change in the next few months, so look out for that new address. Okay, so I'm going to move over to our starting poll now. And if you could answer these questions, we greatly appreciate it. It just helps us understand where you're coming from, why you're here, and what type of landowners we have or non-landowners. A little bit about your trapping or hunting background, and then the number of miles from your local county extension office, which is generally located in your county seat. That just helps us see how valuable the webinar format is and how many miles it might save you from driving to your local extension office for a similar program. So I'll give you a few more minutes to answer those questions. Still a few more coming in. Okay, and I think you can see most of those results as they come in. Okay, thank you very much for that. All right, so we'll move on to the main feature for today. Bob Long is the wild turkey and upland game bird biologist for Maryland DNR. He has been in that position for the last 10 years. He has a bachelor's degree from Virginia Tech and a master's degree from West Virginia University, both in wildlife science. And he's going to talk today about wild turkey biology and management in Maryland, a little bit about the history of the birds in Maryland, and how you can manage your land or land you have access to help promote those populations. All right, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Okay, thank you, Nevin, and hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks for tuning in to the webinar today. We're going to talk a little bit about wild turkey biology and management in Maryland. And we're going to get into the habitat management section in a few minutes, but I just want to start off by giving you a brief introduction to the turkey. There are 5 distinct subspecies of turkeys in North America, but we only have the eastern wild turkey found in this state. Although I suppose some may not consider them to be exceptionally attractive birds, most people describe turkeys at the very least to be entertaining and impressive birds. A lot of folks even use the term magnificent to describe turkeys. Benjamin Franklin thought they would be a better choice than the bald eagle as the national bird. So it's interesting to think how things may be different if the turkey was chosen over the bald eagle. But regardless, their behaviors that include displaying and gobbling are very unique to wild turkeys, and they're a real treat to experience close up. Turkeys are among the most wary of wildlife. They have exceptionally sharp senses. Research has shown that their hearing is 4 times better than ours, and their color vision is 5 times better. So getting close to these birds in the wild is a real challenge for both wildlife watchers and hunters. The range of the eastern wild turkey is highlighted here on this map in blue. And as their name implies, eastern wild turkeys are mainly found in the eastern part of the United States. They're the most abundant and widespread of the subspecies. Now the photo at the top is probably what most of you imagine when you think of turkeys. These are males, which we've referred to as gobblers. They weigh between 16 and 22 pounds. And from a distance, they're most easily identified by their black body and red, white, and blue heads. These are the turkeys that you see gobbling and displaying mainly during the spring, but they don't always display. Sometimes they're, in fact, most of the time, their feathers and tail fin are more smoothed out, and they look more similar to the hens. You can see the photo of the hen on the bottom. These are female turkeys. They're smaller and are more cryptic in coloration. They also do not display or gobble. Rather, they make a variety of apologize for that technical difficulty there. I think we're back on with the sound. Getting a thumbs up from Nevin, so we'll continue on. And as I said, the settlers took advantage of this resource, and as they did with many wildlife species during that time, and they got to the point where they were nearly extinct in Maryland. By the early 1900s, turkeys were only found in the most remote and inaccessible parts of the state. This is mainly out in Garrett and Allegheny counties, and they probably numbered less than 1,000. And in 1919, the state game warden provided that quote that said that turkeys were practically extinct in Maryland. In the 1950s and 60s, the state game department, which we now know as DNR, decided it was time to do something. They began experimenting with ways to restore turkeys. They first tried using pen-raised birds, which turned out to be a complete failure. Pen-raised birds just did not have the instincts to survive and reproduce in the wild. But in 1967, Maryland began trapping and relocating true wild turkeys from the mountains to the other regions in the state that had suitable habitat. And this method was found to be very successful and is the reason we have such strong populations today. As I said, turkeys were only found in the most remote parts of the state, even as late as 1970. This is what the range of turkeys looked like. The tool that proved to be instrumental in the restoration of wild turkey was the cannon net, or later the rocket net. And this was technology borrowed from the waterfowl trapping efforts going on at the same time. As the name implies, this method uses a net that is propelled over the birds by these small rockets. I can get the pointer going. The net is housed in this box, and there are these rockets that are actually fueled by rocket fuel, and when it's detonated, that propels the net over the birds. So here's a typical setup using the rocket net where the birds were baited to a location where the net was set up in the box with the rockets on top, and if everything went correctly, the net deployed, and hopefully you caught a decent number of birds. As you can see, some still managed to run out from under the net or fly out from under the net. Turkeys are very quick for their size. They've been documented running 25 miles per hour, flying 55 miles an hour. So for their size, they still can get going pretty good. So once captured, the turkeys were put into individual boxes and transported to the release site. Only about 15 or 25 birds were released at each site, but this was usually enough to get the population established in that area. And this went on from 1967 to 2009, and over that time period, about 1,300 turkeys were relocated using this method. Well, for the most part, the released birds successfully reproduced and grew in numbers. They filled in nearly all of the available habitat in the state. They also greatly expanded their range and now occur in every county. We have about 30,000 turkeys in Maryland. During the same time period, most states across the country conducted similar restoration programs, and it's really a remarkable conservation success story, not only in Maryland but across the country. In fact, some may argue that the efforts have been too successful. It looks like we had lost the sound there again for some reason, but we're back with it now. So as I was saying, turkeys have increased to the point of becoming nuisance birds in some situations. Luckily in Maryland, we've had limited complaints from landowners and farmers, and the majority of people really seem to enjoy having and seeing turkeys. Now we'll be talking a little bit about nuisance situations later on in the talk. Well, turkeys aren't that abundant everywhere, and this is a map illustrating the varying amounts of turkeys we have across the state. We have a hunting season for turkeys, and we use that data for a variety of things and that we can use to monitor the population with. We use the spring turkey harvest per square mile of forest as an index to turkey density. So where we have more turkeys, you would expect more to be harvested. So basically here the darker areas indicate where turkeys are most abundant. As you can see, the highest populations are in western Maryland and the eastern shore, although they are doing very well in portions of southern Maryland. Central Maryland has the lowest densities of turkeys. This is probably due to a lack of habitat and fragmentation of suitable habitat. So let's move on to the section about habitat management for turkeys. I noticed on the beginning poll there that most of you were landowners, and some had pretty sizable properties. So we can talk about what you can do to manage your habitat for turkeys. And you know, when we ask the question, well, why would you want to manage for turkeys? You know, as I said, they're interesting birds. Most people like to see them, but more than that, you know, people just they like to do something that can actually they can have success with, and turkeys are a good species to do this with because they're what we call habitat generalists. They're different than other species that depend on a very specific habitat type. For example, forest interior dwelling birds, which you may have heard about in other talks or on websites, they need large expanses of unbroken forest. So if you own 10 acres of forest surrounded by cropland, you probably won't be very successful in attracting those birds. On the other hand, most grassland-dependent birds need hundreds of acres of contiguous grassland. So you can create the most ideal grassland habitat, but if it's not large enough, or if your property is located in a mostly forested area, you probably won't see those birds either. Turkeys will use a variety of habitats, so virtually any property in the state has the potential to have turkeys. However, it's important to understand that having the potential doesn't necessarily mean that they will be there without the suitable habitat. Even though they're habitat generalists, individual properties can still be unattractive without the necessary habitat. And I get a lot of calls each year from landowners wondering why they see turkeys down the road on an adjacent property or on an adjacent farm, but they don't see them on their property. So we're going to go through some things to consider here. Anytime you're contemplating management for wildlife, you should be strategic in your planning of how you're going to do things. I think Jim Mullen talked about some of these same concepts on the last webinar about principles of wildlife ecology and management. So here's some things you should ask yourself before you begin. First is what is turkey habitat? You need to have an understanding of what turkey habitat is and how that changes depending on the season. Secondly, you want to try to look at what type of habitat is limiting on your property and make an educated guess about what will make your property more beneficial and attractive to turkeys. And then the last step would be to think about how you create or enhance the habitats that are needed on that property. So let's begin with the first question and talk about turkey habitat. Turkey habitat requirements vary depending on the season, but they're generally found in or near forests. Trees provide safe roosting areas, and they also produce much of the foods that turkeys rely on throughout the year. Although it was once thought that turkeys needed vast expanses of unbroken forest, the expansion of turkeys into untraditional areas in the last few decades has more or less debunked that theory. Now they are most abundant in the mosaic of forest and open land, and it seems that about a 50-50 mix seems ideal in most cases. As I said, the needs of habitat needs of turkeys change seasonally, so it's important to first understand the biology and what they're doing throughout the year that in turn drives those habitat needs. And in the spring, it's all about breeding. Males will gobble and display to attract hens. Typically, one gobbler will mate with many hens, so this is the time of year when you'll see gobblers getting into little scuffles and fights, and they're trying to establish their pecking order. In the spring is also when hens will break away from the flock and go off and search for a suitable nesting site. And this brings me to an important point. Whenever you're thinking about wildlife habitat and how the animals are using that habitat, in the spring you'll most often see turkeys in fields and other open areas. And this is probably because, for one, there's some food in those fields that the birds are attracted to, but it's also where gobblers can display and be seen by the most hens. So they're very visible in open fields. But you need to be very careful and don't assume that the habitat where you see the wildlife the most is the habitat that they need the most. And to further elaborate on that concept, you can see turkeys real clearly in the photo on the right. This is an open field where the bird might strut and be very visible to hens. But he doesn't necessarily need an open field to strut. He can gobble and strut in a woodland situation or in some other habitat and be successful in attracting hens as well. You don't see the bird on the left, and there's actually a hen sitting at the base of that tree that had fallen over there in this thick underbrush in the forest here. And this is really the most important spring habitat, is nesting habitat. You know, if you saw a turkey sitting on a nest, it probably would not be concealed by predators enough to limit predation from predators that are looking for those nests. So it's an important concept to remember. Again, I just want to stress that nesting habitat is the most critical type of habitat in the spring and early summer. This is simply a fallow field, and we had documented turkeys nesting in this field for several years in a row. They will also nest in forest, hedgerows, and other areas, but the key element is to have horizontal cover at ground level to hide the nest from predators. So here are some photos of an open woodlot on the left and a clover field on the right. And these are areas that turkeys will definitely use at times, but they probably will not nest here because there's simply just not enough cover to hide the nest and the hen. And if they do, the nest would likely be unsuccessful. Well, during the laying phase of nesting, hens will lay about 9 to 12 eggs over a 2-week period. This is the time when you see hens in flocks with the gobblers, but often the hens will leave the flock once every day or two and go to the nest to lay an egg. Once incubation starts, they'll sit on the nest almost 24 hours a day for about 26 to 28 days. This is the period when many nests are destroyed by predators, and a fair number of hens are also killed while sitting on the nest. Only about 50% of the nest hatch successfully. But if they do, all the eggs will usually hatch within hours of one another, and the young turkeys, which are called poults, will leave the nest with the hen, usually within a few hours after hatching. During the summer, the key type of habitat is brood habitat. A group of poults is called a brood. The brood is very vulnerable to predators, particularly during the first few weeks when they can't fly. In fact, only about 25% of poults typically survive until the fall. So they need areas with good herbaceous ground cover. And those same areas also need to have plenty of insects to provide the high protein food that they need to grow quickly. So they often use field edges, clear cuts, power line rights of way, or roadsides. Here's an example of some great brood habitat. Here we have a diverse mix of grasses and weeds with plenty of insects. You often see broods in fields like this with ragweed or goldenrod, basically places where the poults can feed underneath the vegetation while the hen can look over the vegetation and spot predators. In early fall, family groups and the broods will start to join together into larger flocks, and they'll tend to become concentrated around food sources. They mainly feed on acorns, beech nuts, wild grapes, and other fruits, and they'll feed on waste grain and crop fields as well. Up to 100 birds can be seen in a single flock if the food is concentrated in one area. This is why turkeys seem to disappear from some properties during the fall and winter. I get calls from landowners that see this. They had birds in the summer and early fall, and then they just seem to disappear. And usually the turkeys did not die or move more than a few miles. Rather, they're likely just grouped up around an important food source. But in the spring and summer, typically they'll return to those sites if there's good habitat, and they'll be more dispersed across the landscape. Winter is also when turkeys will use artificial feeders the most. But feeding really has its own set of issues, and I'm going to address those a little bit later in the talk. As soon as we get a few warm days in late winter or early spring, really around this time of year, the birds will shift back to using fields more and become more visible. They're out in those fields looking for new green growth in the fields that tends to be higher in protein, and they need this protein going into nesting season. This was an exceptionally large flock of about 120 birds that I saw in March a few years ago. So going back to our key questions, we covered what habitat is, and or what turkey habitat is, and how and why it changes seasonally. And now we'll move on to identifying what type of habitat is limiting on your property and how you can make that property more attractive. And a good starting point is to use maps or aerial imagery to get a landscape perspective. Turkeys have home ranges of about 500 to 1,000 acres and sometimes even more. So by looking at both your property and the surrounding area, you can make some educated guesses about where certain habitat features exist. You can identify travel corridors, likely roosting areas, areas with hardwood versus pine forest, and other important habitat types. So I'll get the pointer on here, and you can see that certain things that you want to look for with turkeys is like these drainages can be very important. There's some couple drainages along creeks here where you have connected forest cover, and those are places that typically will be the core area that turkeys will use. They'll roost in the trees, and then they'll likely use the back edges of these fields, some of these back corners, more frequently than, say, out in the middle of a field. So when you're looking at the landscape perspective, you can think of things like, well, what could I do to make this corner more attractive, and maybe a planting of some sort to provide some food in that back corner, maybe a hedgerow that would run along here to make that corner of the field more protected. Things like that is what you can use these aerial photos for. And then you can also look at things like, here's some planted pine forest that's you can see the rows in it versus the hardwood forest here that probably is a better habitat, providing more mast and other food sources in this type of habitat. Those are some of the things you can visualize looking at the aerial imagery. The second step would involve some type of on-the-ground assessment, and this really can vary depending on the goals of your habitat management and how large your property is. You really could get as detailed as you'd like with this site assessment. You can map out individual habitat types at a very fine scale, or you could just do a coarse visual assessment. But the bottom line is you want to identify the major habitat types that you're providing, so then you can then determine what you're missing. Basically answering the question of what is the limiting factor or factors on your property. So here's an example of a crop field adjacent to a mixed forest that's relatively mature. This is a fairly typical situation in Maryland, and the crop field would likely be used by some turkeys for food, and the forest could provide a roosting site and maybe some mast in the forest, but there's very little nesting or brood habitat visible. And this is a woodlot with some saplings in the understory that again is fairly typical of a lot of forest in Maryland. There really is not enough horizontal ground cover at ground level to be suitable for nesting or raising young turkeys. Insect production is probably fairly low here as well. So again, we have a roosting area and a feeding area, but nesting and brood habitat is lacking. And they're the two types of habitat that I see as most limiting on the majority of properties that I've seen in Maryland. This area here would be the exception. This is an overgrown pasture, a large pasture of a couple hundred acres. It has a well-developed layer of shrubs, plenty of horizontal cover, so it would make an excellent nesting location, and broods probably would do well here as well. But there really aren't enough large trees to for turkeys to roost in, and food, at least in the fall and the winter, would probably be very limited. This is a pole-sized loblolly pine forest. We have plenty of these on the lower eastern shore. And it's definitely not the most wildlife-friendly of habitats. Turkeys will use forests like this for roosting. They'll travel through them. But without nearby nesting and brooding areas, there probably wouldn't be much use of this area. There's also very little food in forests like this. So this is just an example of the type of map that you may want to create for your property. It shows various cover types, and this is a property that has an excellent population of turkeys. If you look at the variety and the proximity of the major habitat types, you can see why. Everything is really everything that a turkey needs is located here within about a 100-acre area. There's a core block of forest in the middle. The dark green is a more mature mixed pine hardwood forest, and you've got a recently clear-cut area adjacent to it, and then surrounding the forest that's the primary roosting area, there's various plantings of grasses, and most of them are native grasses, and there's also some crop fields that the birds can use for feeding, nesting, and it really everything is here for the birds. This landowner also enjoys seeing other wildlife like bobwhite quail, and he's been successful in maintaining bobwhite quail on this property as well. So getting back to our key questions, the last step is to think about how to create or enhance those important habitat types that you've identified as needing. A variety of habitat management tools can be used to increase turkey habitat. I grouped them here into three coarse categories: commercial timber harvest, plantings, and management of native vegetation through other methods. And I'll go into a little more detail on each of these. Now, I mentioned that widespread forest clearing in the 1800s was very detrimental to turkey numbers throughout that time period. But in today's landscape, timber harvest can be really beneficial to turkey numbers. We have limited nesting and brood habitat, so timber harvest can be used to provide that important habitat. Clear cuts often create excellent nesting habitat within just a year or two after a cut, and depending on the types of tree species, it's sometimes the best way to manage that forest to get the best regeneration of the desirable trees. Thinnings and various types of selective harvests can also be used successfully in some situations. The sunlight that they allow into the forest will promote herbaceous vegetation for broods and nesting, but the remaining trees can still be used for roosting and mass production. Some things to think about whenever you're thinking about a commercial timber harvest. You should definitely consult a trained forester for advice before beginning. Typically, you want to leave important mass-bearing trees and shrubs when possible. You can also leave the toppings, as they make ideal nesting sites for turkeys. And any skid trails or log landings can be planted in a wildlife-friendly grass and legume mix to provide additional habitat. Various plantings or food plots are another option for creating habitat. Unfortunately, this is what most landowners think of first when it comes to habitat management. But really, traditional food plots usually are not addressing the limiting factor in most situations when food isn't limited. But in certain areas where food is lacking, they can be useful. Often a better option is to plant a perennial grass legume mix that can be used for both food and brood habitat the following summer. Native warm season grasses are a good option to increase nesting habitat. I've found quite a few turkey nests in grass fields planted through the Conservation Reserve Program, the CRP program. And make sure to plant species that are best suited for your site and soil conditions. And again, remember to address the limiting factor. You know, if food is not limiting on your property, then it's really not a good use of your time or money to plant something like corn or some other type of annual food source. So here's a quick list of some of the best species to plant for brood habitat. You can plant things like clovers, alfalfa, ryegrass, or even winter wheat. And then you can get into some of the various mixtures of grasses and legumes, and as I said, warm season grasses. I mean, often you can plant a narrow but long strip of brood habitat with limited equipment and time. In the photo here on the right, we used the edge of a gated road to plant a brood habitat mix. And this strip was really only about an acre or two total acreage, so it really didn't cost that much. But it provided over a mile-long strip of habitat, and turkeys really used it throughout the summer. You could also consider planting trees or shrubs. Turkeys will eat just about any fruit or nut that's produced, so you should always look for species that produce mast, like crab apples, oaks, hickories, dogwoods, or other species like that. They should be planted in early spring for the best results in Maryland. And remember to use tree tubes where deer densities are high. One overlooked aspect of habitat management is what I'm calling managing native vegetation. Basically, I'm talking about just managing what is there naturally. You know, many times there's a great diversity of beneficial plants either already there or they're in the seed bank. And the challenge is finding out how to increase them and also reduce the undesirable species. An easy way to create an excellent brood and nesting habitat is to establish fallow areas where you just let the field grow for 2 to 3 years. Now, at some point, succession will progress and woody species will begin encroaching. But mowing or disking that area will usually set back succession, and control the woody species, and let the field grow again for 2 to 3 years, and you can start over. You can also do what we call edge feathering with either chainsaws or bulldozers to create a soft edge that is really good for a lot of wildlife species, not only turkeys. Herbicides are sometimes very useful for habitat management. We, in the lower photo there, we used a selective herbicide to spray a small area of sweet gum trees. These trees had little wildlife value. What came back was a lush understory of herbaceous vegetation in the first year. I saw a brood of turkeys using this area regularly that first summer. And then by the second year, there was even more well-developed understory, and we suspected that a hen nested there that second summer. There's a variety of cost share programs available to landowners for establishing wildlife habitat. You can get money for things like native grass and tree planting, edge feathering, and a variety of other practices. And just a note to remember to avoid disturbing nesting and brood cover between April 15th and August 15th. Turkeys are unlike most other birds. Sometimes they actually will not return to the nest after they've been flushed off of it. It really depends on what stage of nesting that they're in, but the best advice is to be very careful doing anything that time of year where you suspect turkeys may be nesting. Well, I mentioned the concept of a soft edge, and here's a simple diagram to help you visualize it. You may have seen something similar to this in a previous webinar or some other source of information. Whenever you have a mature forest adjacent to a field of some type, it's generally a good practice to have a gradient of vegetation along the edge. And you really can get to this point in 2 ways. You could cut some trees along the field and let succession take place, or you could give up some of the field and allow the shrubs and small trees to grow out in that direction. But either way you do it, it provides important habitat along the edges of the fields that otherwise would be of little value. So here's an example of some of the habitat work that a landowner did in an overly mature hedgerow. Before he did most of this, before he did this work, most of this hedgerow here was all tall trees. They were really shading out much of the desirable habitat. They weren't worth very much commercially, so they simply went in with a bulldozer and pushed some of the trees into brush piles and created this irregularly shaped soft edge. They also planted a food plot of sorghum next to it, and they left the center of the field fallow and came up in some looks like some ragweed and some other beneficial herbaceous vegetation there. So it turned out to be some great brood habitat. And this property really has an abundance of turkeys and as well as a lot of other wildlife. And they've done things like this throughout their farm, and I really think it's the reason that they've been so successful in keeping wildlife and population strong there. I just want to remind you not to overlook the effects of deer on your habitat. Okay, it's very easy to see what deer do to planted trees or to crops, but sometimes the effects aren't as noticeable to other vegetation. And here's a tree planting that we did on a wildlife management area. And we intentionally left plenty of space in between the trees to maintain for brood habitat. And the ragweed came in there real strong, and ragweed fields are actually fantastic brood habitat. They are probably the best brood habitat you can get. They produce plenty of insects, and there's usually enough room in between the plants that the poults can walk around and feed underneath the plants. But here the ragweed never grew more than a few inches high, and it really wasn't very useful. But what we noticed when we started looking around was the ragweed inside the wire where we had planted these trees was actually about 3 or 4 feet tall. It was the same ragweed that was out here that was being mowed down by deer. And you know, ragweed is not on any list of preferred foods for deer. It was surprising to us that they were eating it like this, but they were having a real impact on the habitat we were trying to create in this situation. So it's important to realize that. That pretty much finishes up the habitat management part of the webinar, but I want to take a second to talk about a sort of a newly emerging issue related to turkeys, what some may call nuisance turkeys. We are getting an increasing number of calls each year about turkeys that I guess have pretty much worn out their welcome in some situations. Here's a photo that a landowner sent me from his backyard where I suspect he was probably feeding them, judging by the 7 or 8 squirrels there and the bird feeder in the background. I think it's safe to say that these were being fed. And you know, he was like most landowners. He was thrilled to see the turkeys. They had just showed up, especially all the young turkeys. And you know, it is exciting to see this. But sometimes those cute little turkeys can become quite a problem. You know, they'll become habituated to humans just like geese will or deer, and eventually turkeys that have no fear of people will eventually cause some problems. They can block traffic, peck at windows, peck at cars. They leave droppings on everything, and sometimes they can even become aggressive towards pets and small children. So our advice is really just please just don't feed the turkeys. And another real problem with feeding turkeys is the transmission of diseases. This is a bird out of a small flock of turkeys in Washington County, and they were being fed by the local landowner there at the bird feeder, and he was excited to have them. But 3 of the turkeys had symptoms like this one. It turns out we tested them, and they were tested positive for a newly found disease called LPDV. It has a longer name that I won't bore you with, but this was the first occurrence in Maryland of this new disease, and it really seems that this disease and other diseases are much more common in flocks that are being fed. Lastly, I just want to mention that turkey populations are really to a point where we have abundant hunting opportunities for any hunters out there. I noticed in that poll that quite a few of you were hunters. We actually get a lot of useful data from our turkey hunters that allow us to monitor the population and make management decisions. We regulate the harvest at the state level to ensure a strong future population, but private landowners that are interested in hunting can also follow the same guidelines to make sure that they aren't over-harvesting their birds or harming the resource. Hunting turkeys in the spring is a great way to use the resource without harming the population. Only male turkeys are legal in the spring, and as I said before, one gobbler mates with many hens, so there's always a surplus of gobblers in the population. And research has shown that up to 1/3 of the gobblers can be harvested per year with no impact on the population. Things are a little different in the fall. We only have a hunting season in 3 western counties in the fall. There you can take either gobblers or hens, so we need to be a little more conservative, and we recommend that less than 10% of the total number of birds be taken. But turkey hunting really is an exciting type of hunting. It's very sustainable when regulated, as it is in Maryland, and it's also a good way to make sure that you keep the turkeys wild and don't create nuisance situations like I talked about on the previous slide. So just quickly summarize some of the key points. Wild turkey populations are high, but without proper habitat, individual properties may still be unattractive to turkeys. Habitat management efforts should focus on meeting all the habitat needs in a relatively small area. Nesting, brood cover are probably the most important, but you also need roosting areas and foraging opportunities. And timber harvest, plantings, and management of native vegetation should all be considered, and they're all useful for creating that desired habitat. And lastly, just monitor the response of habitat changes. Understand what works and what doesn't, and then you can fine-tune your management going into the future. And if you'd like some more information about turkeys or have any questions, you can contact me directly. My information's there. We have a state tree nursery that you can purchase shrubs and trees for wildlife at reasonable prices. Just want to mention the National Wild Turkey Federation. They've been a great partner in our turkey restoration program, and they also provide help to landowners in plantings and things like that. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Soil Conservation Districts can let you know about any of the cost share programs like the CRP program or any of the other programs to establish wildlife habitat. So with that, it brings us to the end of the webinar, and if you have any questions, feel free to type them in now.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. Yeah, as Bob said, please enter any questions into the chat box. While you're doing that, we're going to move on to the post-program evaluation, and then we'll come back and give Bob a chance to answer those questions. So if you could please fill out this poll, we'd really appreciate it. This is kind of our webinar version of our standard University of Maryland program evaluation form. And we have a few more questions for you once you've answered these. While you're doing that, I can answer Michelle's question. We have not pre-certified this program for any continuing education credits. I happen to run the Master Logger program, so if anyone's interested in those, I can certainly award those credits. If you are interested in submitting this program for CE credits, we can put together an agenda and send that to you to use. Okay, Master Naturalist. That shouldn't be a problem. I happen to be on the Master Naturalist Steering Committee, so. Michelle, if you could email me at, provide my email address and get you set up with that. Okay, great. Thanks for answering those questions. I'll move on to the next screen here. So again, we're just trying to see what you got out of this program. The dollar amount, I know that's a difficult one to answer, but it does help us to be able to show that our programs help you actually save money. So kind of think abstractly about this. I guess the best comparison would be if you had to go pay a consultant to learn this information, what do you think that would cost you? Oh, I had one closed there. I'll open that one. Okay, great. Thanks for that. So we'll just move back to Bob's screen here and get his contact information back up. And if there's any more questions, I'll be happy to try to answer those. Oops. There we go. Okay. Well, that's great. I guess Bob did a really thorough job of explaining everything one could possibly know about turkey wildlife, turkey habitat. So just one last chance for any questions. Otherwise, I'll wrap it up and thank Bob very much for sharing his expertise. Oh, there's a question. So Bob, how is the population going?
I guess he's referring to how the population is doing, and that would depend on the region of the state that you're referring to. We have strong populations in some places, and then other places they're there, but sort of at a low level. So Eastern Shore is doing quite well, and in fact, probably Talbot and Caroline counties have the strongest populations in the state right now. Queen Anne's and Kent are doing well. The lower shore has seen some evidence of population declines over the last 10 years. So we're kind of monitoring that closely. There's still plenty of turkeys, but it may have just been a string of bad luck with some poor nesting seasons, and we'll see what happens here in the coming year. Last year was a good year for nesting, so we're hoping to see a return. And I guess Dorchester County falls into that category of the lower shore, where they have declined somewhat in the last 10 years, but we're expecting to see them increase here in the next year or two. And it really depends on annual production, annual poult production, and how well they do during that nesting season.
Great. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll wrap it up there. And once again, thanks very much to Bob Long. Please tune back in for our upcoming webinars. Bring the schedule back up here. And our exit music. Okay, thanks everyone.